to first acknowledge also that I'm presenting today on Aboriginal lands and pay my respects to the Cabrogal people of the Darug Nation. So today I will be presenting a case study that's titled Planting Seeds of Health, Mind-Body Trauma Recovery for an Older Adult Refugee. So the aims of this case presentation is to firstly illustrate the complexity of assessing trauma symptoms in older adult refugees who often present with comorbid conditions, as well as to present a rationale for incorporating SEEDS principles in an integrative and multimodal approach to trauma recovery. So I'd like to introduce my client, who I'll refer to as Heng. Heng has given me consent to share his story today, but I've deliberately changed some details to maintain confidentiality. So Heng is from a Southeast Asian country and an ethnic minority group. He's 82 years old and he speaks 5 different languages, including English. Most of the time, an interpreter was used in his preferred language. His religion is Buddhist. He has tertiary level qualifications. He's an Australian citizen and he arrived in the country in 1979. And to date, we've had 31 sessions of counselling. So Heng had self-referred to STARTS with the help of his GP due to severe distress, insomnia, flashbacks and nightmares relating to past refugee trauma following a recent marriage breakdown 2 months before the referral, as well as a heart attack 1 month before the referral. And prior to this, he hasn't sought help for his mental health before. In terms of his trauma history, Heng lived through war and a political dictatorship. So systematic state terrorism is a concept coined by Ignacio Martin Barro, a psychologist from the Global South, describing the process by which a state can maintain control over a population through both targeted and random attacks. The outcome is that individuals live in unpredictable helplessness and social cohesion breaks down. This has long-standing effects on the mental health of an individual as well as on an intergenerational and community level. So Heng was targeted because of his status as an intellectual, his high socioeconomic status, and being from an ethnic minority group. His sister was shot and killed while his family was escaping a massacre. So Heng describes this vivid memory that's frozen in time. There were all these soldiers, barely teenage boys, shooting people indiscriminately in the fields. People were falling dead all around me. The child soldiers had taken my glasses away. I crawled and fumbled along the path in front of me. I could barely see. I was terrified and humiliated. So in addition to these traumatic experiences in his country of origin, he also survived a dangerous boat journey to Australia. Here is a genogram outlining Heng's family. So Heng has 2 children in their 40s. He lives with his adult son. He is separated from his wife and she lives with their daughter's family. She occasionally visits Heng's home to maintain the house. Heng is unfortunately estranged from his daughter and her family and does not see his young grandchildren. He finds his adult son difficult to talk to and says he often blames him for their family problems. Heng's parents are deceased and had lived overseas, and he had the opportunity to visit them when they were still alive. He has 1 sister who died during the war and 2 other siblings who live overseas. And Heng's psychosocial adjustment to Australia has been complex. There is long-standing family discord. So he married his ex-wife in Australia, who was from a different culture, and he has distant relationships with his children and grandchildren. The recent marriage breakdown was triggered by frequent verbal arguments and verbal aggression, which resulted in an AVO being placed against Heng by his wife. He was never able to work in his field of study or have his multiple qualifications recognised in Australia. And unfortunately, rather than enjoying the social status and respect generally given to an intellectual and an elder in his cultural community, he has experienced a loss of status due to cultural stigma around his family issues. And then the wider Australian community perceives himself as this useless and vulnerable old man who has been mugged, has had his money stolen, targeted because of his elderly age, and experienced racism throughout his decade in Australia. So here I have also outlined some of the challenges of aging within the normal life cycle, particularly for older adults like Heng who have experienced trauma. And Dr. John Ardern has just spoken a lot about many of these factors. So I won't read through all of them, but for Heng, a significant issue was the interpersonal crisis of losing his wife's companionship after the separation. He also describes that many of his friends had passed away and that death is frequently on my mind, despite denying any thoughts of suicide. And while he has maintained a fair level of mobility at his age, his health issues are also a significant source of anxiety. So putting this all together, the interactional effect of Heng's trauma history, his resettlement and cultural transition difficulties, and the life cycle challenges of aging can be understood through Arosh and Coelho's complex interaction model of the refugee experience, which is pictured here. So one of the core themes of trauma is the loss of control. Within the refugee experience, this occurs not only in the moment of a catastrophe, but continues to reverberate in an individual's subsequent life as they face the overwhelming challenges of resettlement in a new country, culture, and language, and the tasks of the normal lifespan, often with a shattered worldview and nervous system. So now I will talk a bit about my assessment process with Heng. I used a semi-structured clinical interview, a mental state examination, a couple of psychometric tools, and collateral information from his GP. So the Harvard Trauma Questionnaire and Hopkins Symptoms Checklist are empirically validated psychometric tools for use in refugee populations to assess symptoms of trauma, anxiety, and depression. So Heng was symptomatic on all of these measures. In terms of the mental state examination, there were certain observations which I think warranted further assessment, and it wasn't clear to me whether these were because of mental health issues or perhaps neurocognitive decline. So Heng presented of stated age. He was a small and short man who was neatly dressed, wore glasses, and had appropriate grooming. His mood was dysphoric. He had very labile affect with significant psychomotor agitation. He stood up at times in the counselling room while describing distressing content and frequently raised his voice. So his speech was very pressured, loud, and I found it quite difficult to actually speak or to interrupt him. And the content was, centered around his marriage, seemed perseverative at times, and he often interrupted me and missed some spoken cues. He did appear to have some difficulty identifying emotions. There was no evidence of perceptual disturbance or formal thought disorder, though I did notice elements of disorientation and memory concentration difficulties. So, for example, there was a time when I noticed he tried to call me a couple of times at 2 a.m. in the morning. And when I asked him about this during work hours, he said he had woken and panicked about his appointment time, which was actually at 2 p.m. And there was another instance where he was ushered into the counselling room that he had been to a number of times, but sat down expectantly in the adjacent kitchenette. And other times it was often unclear to me which period of his life he was describing, and appeared to be a bit of an unreliable historian. So the challenge was that many of these symptoms, as well as other changes in mood and behaviour and recent onset sleep disturbance, these can be caused by both mental health issues or cognitive decline, as well as the effects of his recent heart attack. And it was unclear to me initially what was the cause in Heng's case. I also didn't know his pre-morbid functioning. He didn't feel comfortable giving me a contact for a family member, and with the GP, he advised that he attended appointments very infrequently. So Heng had been assessed by a geriatrician 10 years ago with no findings of abnormality then. And I asked him to discuss these concerns with his GP again, and with his consent liaise directly with the GP to see whether a new geriatrician referral might be appropriate in conjunction to my work with him in trauma counselling. So while holding on to the possibility of some comorbid cognitive decline, it was also clear that Heng's presentation was one of trauma. In outlining his presentation here through the 5 Ps formulation, I've sort of put quotation marks around delayed onset PTSD symptoms, as he'd likely been living with post-traumatic stress for many decades now, but could get by just on one level of his functioning. But it was clear now that there is marked recent decompensation. So he had severe intrusion symptoms, avoidance of triggers, hyperarousal and anxiety, low mood and negative cognitions, irritability and agitation, and an element of traumatic grief. There was also a high level of anxiety, rumination, and somatic symptoms and physiological panic symptoms, as well as rigid sort of catastrophic thought content around health anxiety and themes of mistrust and abuse. There was a severe sleep disturbance and a poor appetite, as well as social difficulties. So yeah, he had a fair bit of social anxiety, low self-esteem, sort of, feels that he's not good at socializing and seems to have a social skills deficit, and often thinks of himself as worthless and defective. And in addition, there were the health issues. So with the recent heart attack, as well as other issues with hypertension, vision and dental issues, he was taking a number of heart medications following the recent procedure, as well as some painkillers. And in terms of predisposing factors, it's clear that his traumatic experiences 45 years ago and the psychological and physiological sequelae, this allostatic load of the cumulative trauma throughout his lifetime, it was a significant factor. There's also possible genetic diathesis and trait anxiety, and likely modelling of maladaptive behaviours and emotions within his family of origin. And it could be worth considering into the impacts of intergenerational trauma here. And there was also his own perceived low status as a refugee and the racism and difficult cultural transition he had in Australia. I think the precipitating factors were quite clearly the marriage and family breakdown and the associated social, cultural and self-stigma, as well as the interactional effect of ageing, stress and trauma on his neurobiology. And with the perpetuating factors, I think there was a bidirectional relationship between the severe sleep disturbance and the PTSD symptoms. So those two things sort of maintain each other, as well as a bit of a lack of adaptive coping skills, which maintains the depressive symptoms and rumination. So he had no routine, little enjoyable activities, little supports. And yeah, with the situation of estrangement from his family and social isolation was a big issue, as well as I think, with the observed lack of social skills and perhaps a capacity to mentalize, this may perpetuate loneliness and co-create these sort of patterns of poor communication within his family. And finally, there's the effects of living in chronic high stress and the impact on his mind and body. Heng did have a number of protective factors though. So his high cognitive reserve and high level of education, intelligence, and being fluent in 5 languages, that was a significant protective factor, we know, in the literature against neurocognitive decline. Heng's trauma also occurred in adulthood, and by his accounts, he had a relatively stable childhood. And survivors of trauma in adulthood generally have a better prognosis than those who've experienced developmental trauma at a time when their personality structures are still being integrated. He's motivated to maintain good physical and mental health. He's help seeking, and he was also quite capable and able to advocate for what he wanted from a service. And I do think that we had a strong therapeutic alliance. So when Heng first came to counselling, it was, he wasn't sure what he wanted to get out of it, other than, the knowledge that he needed help. And he wanted to restore his marriage, which unfortunately was a little bit outside of my scope of work. But with a bit of further exploration, he could identify he wanted to improve his mood, reduce stress, and think more positively. And now in my mind, I thought that my goals were fairly consistent with his goals. Firstly, I wanted to have diagnostic clarification around the cognitive difficulties. I wanted to help Heng to establish internal safety and stabilisation, which I'll talk more about later on. To improve his depressed mood and rumination, to help him to connect meaningfully with others, and perhaps to support processing of some of his past trauma. So here, sorry, it's a bit of a chaotic slide, but it shows the stepped approach I took in treatment planning with Heng. So there are a number of issues which I sort of roughly conceptualized through a version of Maslow's hierarchy of needs, but it doesn't really represent a linear path. We've sort of gone back and forth along all these different steps. But yeah, firstly, I started with sleep because I could see that without first addressing this basic need, it would be very difficult to recover in other areas and it was impairing his overall functioning. So we started there. And once sleep was improved, we moved on to the need for safety and security. This applied both internally and externally. It was important for Heng to feel safe in his own body and that the world around him was predictable. To do this, we introduced some mind-body regulation strategies to help him increase his control over seemingly involuntary sensations like heart palpitations. And actually seeing his blood pressure decrease and learning that he could, to an extent, take control of his health was very reassuring for Heng. Another element of safety and stabilization was fostering what we call dual awareness and helping him to differentiate between the then and now in his trauma narrative and being able to recount these experiences and situate them in the past rather than present, moving from explicit to implicit memory was also a form of basic reprocessing. Next, looking at the need for love and belonging, Heng reported this deep loneliness and that he'd never been good at making friends. To address this, the therapeutic alliance was very important, as well as some help with social skills, and I'll discuss this more later. Next was with self-esteem. We used CBT to sort of address some of those negative core beliefs and his low self-esteem. And actually sharing my case conceptualization with him, all those things I discussed before, also helped him to sort of reattribute responsibility for his own perceived deficits, which helped to lessen feelings of shame and self-blame. And now the top of Maslow's hierarchy concerns human flourishing, and I would argue that post-traumatic growth can be understood as a form of this. And we gradually sort of moved from an approach of sort of addressing problems to now sort of reaching for higher order goals. And elements of acceptance and commitment therapy were used here to help him to explore his values and valued life directions, his goals, and what sort of legacy he'd like to leave. And the ACT experiential exercises were also useful in helping him to practice cognitive diffusion and increase his psychological flexibility, which did help with anxiety. And now moving through each of these steps, I monitored his neurocognitive symptoms and any changes over time. And reviewing that progress provided me with interesting data, which sort of supported my hypothesis that maybe the initial cognitive concerns were secondary to reversible factors like sleep disturbance, depression, or PTSD, rather than a degenerative condition like MCI or dementia, as he did improve remarkably. And finally, case management was used through the whole process. And with the help of a student at STARTS on placement, we referred Heng to My Aged Care to support his current independent living needs. We also looked at senior social groups he could connect with and, of course, a liaison with the GP. I just want to highlight that some very basic common factors at the beginning of therapy, I think, were quite fundamental to his recovery. So, outside of any sort of modality or approach, just the basic feeling of safety and relief in sharing his story, the felt sense of, peace and safety in the therapeutic relationship and, creating hope in change. So it was important to highlight those factors in his recovery. And now here we have Dr. John Ardern's seeds, which he eloquently discussed before. And these are factors of sleep, education, exercise, diet, and social connectivity played a really crucial role in Heng's recovery and development of neuroplasticity. So sleep and social connection were particularly important. With sleep, Heng had previously been reliant on benzodiazepines and painkillers to get to sleep. So I provided psychoeducation on the effects of these and, the reasons why it might be good to improve his sleep through other means like sleep hygiene. So with some support and adjustment of his routine, his sleep did significantly improve, and mindfulness exercises also helped here. With social connections, an important element of the therapeutic alliance was actually providing feedback and modelling of what healthy adult communication and relationship can look and feel like. So what I mean by that was sort of, providing moment to moment, both verbal and non-verbal feedback through, my words and facial expressions. There were were a couple of times when, there was an argument or a rupture with an interpreter who was used, and these opportunities, were treated as learning opportunities, and, we reviewed what went wrong and what went right. And there was some, we did some work around sort of explicit social skills, like identifying emotions, perspective taking, other conversational skills, and things like the DBT-DMAN acronym. And we reviewed interactions he's had with people throughout his week. And of course, there's the ongoing goal of connecting to a senior social group. With exercise, we used behavioural activation to, increase his daily activity, get a bit of a routine going, which includes walking and incidental exercise. We also used heart rate variability biofeedback training to, help regulate his sort of, hyperarousal symptoms and bodily functioning through his breathing. And with education, I think the experience of therapy itself has been a form of new learning for Heng, developing new neural pathways in his brain. And Heng has expressed he feels like he's learning new skills each time in counselling. And I've also encouraged him to maintain his interest in keeping up to date with world news, as well as learning new recipes on YouTube and mastering technology at his age. Lastly, with diet, we did discuss the benefits of a GP referral to a dietitian to support his heart health, and also, encourage his self-directed interest in learning new recipes and adding variety to his diet. So these elements of SEEDS were the building blocks of neuroplasticity, helping Heng's brain to change adaptively, even in old age, in response to new and positive experiences. This is connected with improved general well-being. Just a quick note on transference and countertransference. This isn't the focus of this presentation, but the parallel processes in our relationship was really significant, I think, in Heng's recovery. So look, we have a common sort of Pan-Asian background. It's very clear just from my appearance and his perception of me. And we also happen to have a shared language, which neither of us was our preferred or most fluent language, although we do have a different ethnic background. So with this in mind, the age gap was challenging to navigate in hierarchical and filial Asian culture, and dealing with the perceived role reversal of a young woman like me giving advice to an elderly man. I think this did affect his willingness to broach certain topics or express certain emotions. It was likely on some level that he viewed me as a daughter. And while this realization initially caused some discomfort, this dynamic, I guess, was actually harnessed to bring about a corrective emotional experience, considering his relationship with his own children. And it's likely he actually responded so well to therapy in part because of this identification. And I did have my own challenging countertransference reactions in the process, which were just important to be mindful of, and I benefited from reflective supervision. So now moving on to outcomes. After a year of counselling, Heng achieved remission of PTSD intrusion symptoms, decreased anger and emotional reactivity, his sleep improved, his memory and cognition also improved. There was improved psychological flexibility, he's working on his social and conversational skills, he's maintained a healthy blood pressure quite consistently and a good appetite, and importantly, a shift to living in the here and now. So he describes enjoying his life now, he's future oriented, and he's working towards meaningful goals. And here are just some quick psychometric outcomes. At the second sort of measure, the PTSD and depression scores were below threshold for clinical anxiety, but the anxiety symptoms as assessed by the Hopkins Symptoms Checklist were still significant. So from here on, our session frequency has decreased and is largely focused on maintenance and relapse prevention. We're using ACT ongoing to continue to address his anxiety and, cultivate psychological flexibility and reflect on his values. And I'd like to continue helping him with, his social skills and to join a senior social group and work on positive communication with his family. So to summarise, Heng is an 82-year-old Southeast Asian male who initially presented with mood, anxiety and trauma symptoms in the context of a recent marriage breakdown and heart attack, as well as on the background of refugee trauma. In addition, there were cognitive and behavioural symptoms of uncertain origin. Now, over a year of integrated counselling, incorporating SEED's principles for mind-body health, he has achieved psychological recovery as well as improvement in his physical health and cognitive abilities. This case, I think, demonstrates how symptoms of trauma can manifest in the mind and body in an interactional way with aging-related processes, and how sometimes psychological therapy can actually result in improved cognitive functioning and physical health. And on a personal level, I bear witness to Heng's courage and dignity in choosing to seek help at this stage in his life. I honour the ways in which he has learned to survive through so much adversity until now, and his willingness to learn new skills and ways of being in the world in his ongoing journey to healing. So thank you very much for the opportunity to present on this case within START's counselling. Here are my contact details as well as START's contact details. And on this page, we've just got some references. So thank you.